Early history tended to focus and to dramatize the settler population, leaving aside the fact that there was an indigenous population that lived here, that received them, that we tend to ignore the failures at assimilation. That provided some of the basis for what led to the coup d'etat and the subsequent wars. That cleavage that had not been addressed over time. Today it's very difficult because any percentage of so-called Americo-Liberians, numbers are so small that they have no means of doing it, and they themselves, everybody today is reaching for a common heritage and trying to find that common history, trying to find that common identity. That's what we're all searching for. And so it has been a long time problem, and we've paid the price for that, for the failure to address that over time.
Liberia is a West African nation, that's out of the question. Liberia in the modern day is seen as another poor, disease-ridden, unstable, struggling African nation, and I can't blame anyone for thinking that. Liberia, however, may not be a nation that changed the world. However, it is a nation that, in my opinion, has a much more interesting history than the Western world gives credit for. Liberian history isn't like most African nations nor the world. It never became a colony of a European power, nor did native peoples resist to keep independence. It was a nation dominated by, out of all peoples, former American slaves. So how did former American slaves end up in Liberia, and how did these people affect Liberia in the long run? That's what I will be answering in this video. Before I start, I just want to make one thing clear. No, this isn't a video justifying Confederate independence, nor something that's meant to justify racism against African Americans. This is only a Black History Month video that I thought of making and thought would be interesting to share. Since the 1800s, some abolitionists in the United States wanted to end slavery by killing two birds with one stone, to both end slavery and appease Southern slave owners. To do this, an idea formed among some abolitionists and even free people of color, like Paul Cuffey. The idea was to return free slaves to Africa to return to their homes, despite American slaves living in America for generations. The reason for this idea was because Southern slave owners feared a large free black population down south would cause instability and race riots. This quick solution of returning free slaves to Africa would appease both sides in abolitionist eyes, thereby both ending slavery and appeasing Southern slave owners. But this idea never really took off, with the common idea among abolitionists being full emancipation. However, this didn't stop some organizations from taking this idea into their own hands. In 1817, the American Colonization Society would be formed and would implement the idea of sending freed slaves to Africa. This would be the first of many colonial societies. They would send out their first ship in 1820 with freed slaves to a region near modern-day Monrovia. This would set a trend of many colonial societies sending freed slaves to the region, and these slaves would make many colonies like the Republic of Maryland, Kentucky in Africa, Mississippi, Africa, and Louisiana, Liberia. These American colonization societies would send journeys to modern-day Liberia from 1820 to 1838. Also, fun fact, the transferring of former American slaves is why there are so many town names of American heritage, like Greenville or Rivercrest, and why there are so many American names in Liberia, like Charles Taylor or Roosevelt Johnson. As the years went on into the 1830s in the United States, support for American colonization dwindled, if any support at all. particularly in northern states, where abolitionists called for full emancipation and assimilation for black slaves. Despite the waning support for American Liberia, the American colonization societies still sent freed slaves to Liberia as they considered themselves humanitarians and being good Christians. Each disaster and disease death reported from Liberia only encouraged them more as they believed it was challenges given by God, testing man. These societies also kept hidden the high mortality rates as they knew it would be the end of these organizations if the high mortality rates were made public. The American colonial societies gradually would give the Liberian colonies more self governance as time went on. First, all the Liberian colonies would be reorganized into the Commonwealth of Liberia in 1839, and in 1847, the American colonial societies gradually pushed Liberia into independence, with Liberia declaring itself as an independent nation on July 26, 1847. Britain and France would recognize the colony as independent, but the United States, due to Southern opposition, wouldn't recognize the nation until 1862, when there was no Southern opposition because of the American Civil War. The USA now officially saw Liberia as independent. Now that Liberia has independence, what now? What was this new nation like? You may think that freed slaves would see the indigenous populations as equal, right? After all, they were from the same continent and were technically their people. However, these freed slaves didn't see the indigenous peoples as equals. In fact, they saw them as inferiors and made themselves into the new class called the Americo-Liberians. These freed slaves become the new whites of Liberia, treating the indigenous populations as how the white people in the South treated them. Despite being no more than 5% of the population, the Americo-Liberians kept the indigenous population down for so long because of good relations with the USA, having modern tech, having higher education, poor indigenous population, illiterate indigenous population, denial to the coastal regions, and keeping the resources. This basically affected the 1800s to 1900s American segregation system in a much worse way. The reason for Americo-Liberian segregation was because of a feeling to civilize the native peoples of Liberia by being educated by Western standards and conversion to Christianity. When it came to the political establishment in Liberia, there were two main factions that were important. First was the Liberian Party, founded in 1848, that would be later known as the Republican Party, not to be confused with the other Republican Party. The Republican Party was founded by poor mixed-race Americo-Liberians. The other faction was the True Whig Party, and again, not to be confused with the other Whig Party. This party was founded in 1869 by darker-skinned Americo-Liberians and was backed by rich Americo-Liberians. Just so we're clear, indigenous people were made sure not to be involved in the political system or even have the right to vote by both parties. The Republican Party would take power and win the presidency after getting independence and winning the first presidential election in 1847, suppressing the opposition. This went on until 1869 when the new party, the True Whig Party, won the presidency with Edward James Roy. The Republicans would take it back in 1871 after Roy's death, but would quickly lose it again in 1878. From then on, the True Whig Party would hold power in Liberia for another century. Going into the 20th century, many things would change for Liberia, the first being the collapse of the Liberian dollar in 1907, which then made Liberia switch to American dollars. The United States would send troops in 1909 to Liberia due to the nation facing a crisis of border disputes, native revolts, and debt to foreign nations. So the United States sent the Army and Navy, along with many black officers like Charles Young, which can be a story on its own, to train the Liberian Army. And in 1912, Liberia signed a $1.7 million loan from the four nations of the USA, France, Britain, and Germany, having control of Liberia's finances until 1926. Now the US ensured Liberian protection by checking European expansion, guarding the shores, suppressing native revolts, and having control of the finances, essentially turning Liberia into an American colony. In 1930, the League of Nations would publish a report detailing a gruesome report. This report denounced the Liberian government as the League discovered Liberia still had slavery well into the 20th century and suppressment of the native peoples for the sole benefit of dominating another race. Although the only thing that would come out of this will be the resignation of President Charles D.B. King, it does show that Liberia still had slaves even after most of the world had ended it. Throughout the World Wars, Liberia would join the Americans and would primarily export rubber and iron, and in return, America would construct seaports, airports, and roads into Liberia's interior, but the Americo-Liberians still very much held power. In the Cold War, Liberia would receive millions in both foreign investments and American aid to resist the spread of communism in Africa. In the 70s, Liberia would start to take a more independent foreign policy under President William Tolbert by making connections with communist nations. However, disaster would soon hit. In 1979, a disgruntled population protested in the streets of Monrovia, Liberia, over the Liberian government's plan to raise rice prices. President Tolbert ordered a firing on the protesters, resulting in the deaths of over 70 people. This was the tipping point for the population. Now riots ensued all over the country that led to a military coup by Samuel Doe, leading to the end of Americo-Liberian domination of the country. And that is where our story ends.
Why every African American person used to think they could make fun of Africans back in high school?
That's a good question. I got the answers. Stay tuned. The reason why African Americans was making fun of Africans in high school is because, simple, we were lied to. America created this false silver lining for African Americans saying, we know we enslaved you. We know that's bad. But if we didn't enslave you, you'd be in Africa fighting diseases and eating each other. America led us to believe the more American you are, the better you are in life. And Africa, you want to stay way away from it.
So let's keep it real and have this conversation in, right? We said we were lied to and told. The more American you are, the more better you are in life. And that's exactly what we was lost in the South Scene. As a matter of fact, some would say we was indoctrinated by American exceptionalism. And as somebody with a master's degree in education, I'm going to start this by saying that American exceptionalism is embedded into the curriculum. Because a lot of us as African Americans will allow for this settler master paradigm to sit in our minds, and we'll really buy into American exceptionalism. It's the idea that the United States is inherently different from the other nations, being perceived both domestically and internationally as superior. He ended his video by saying, America led us to believe the more American we are, the better we are in life. And a lot of us play it out in terms of how we relate to folks in the African diaspora. And this one I started getting into how insidious our enslavement was. This country literally taught us, we know we enslaved you, but look at your people over there where we saved you from. You better be lucky that you ain't living in a primitive state with famine and war, and you lucky that we enslaved you. As a matter of fact, some of us was taught that our enslavement was part of saving our souls and civilizing us. You think about how American exceptionalism work, it's perceived as saying that because you are American, you are superior. Think about it. Back in the day, we ain't had the internet. You feel me? I'm from Texas. I know folks that's from New York and California. All of us was talking about African booty scratchers. Who taught us that? In the words of Malcolm X, who taught us to hate ourselves? But you can't hate the roots without hating the tree, right? I was trying to stay away from essentialism, but literally everything we've been taught in America about Africa is from the people that enslaved us. They not finna teach us the truth. We was really lied to. We was really lied to, and we bought into the inferiority of our own people. We'll take this idea of American exceptionalism and we'll project it on to everybody in the diaspora, whether they in the Caribbean or whether they in Africa. When I say education is elevation, I'm talking about unlearning and relearning a lot of things we've been taught in this world. I began this video by talking about education, the curriculum, how we are taught. Not only how we taught like math and science and history and how Europeans found and located everything, but also how the media teaches. Remember those Feed the Children Africa commercials? We was really led to believe that folks in Africa cannot survive without the presence of the Europeans. Don't that sound familiar? If I'm being real, a lot of what we've been taught in the African diaspora about each other came from the people that colonized us and enslaved us. We got to think about that. Because I also know a lot of y'all believe that African Americans are inherently lazy. Education is elevation.
Galunchugu, galunchugu, ah.